It was always Grant. His name carried weight in every conversation, every family gathering, every Sunday dinner where I sat quietly chewing while he boomed on about closing some deal or getting another award for Salesman of the Year. My mother would laugh, her eyes crinkling just so, and my father would nod like Grant was some sort of Wall Street god instead of a guy selling overpriced kitchen appliances. And me? I was dependable, stable, boring. A software engineer with good credit and a quiet condo in Crescent Hollow, a few miles from the house I grew up in, but apparently galaxies away from the limelight. They called me when something needed fixing. Not broken things, not really, just broken finances. The kind of problems that could be solved with a wire transfer. Hey honey, your father and I are in a bit of a pinch, or Grant's having a tough month. Do you mind helping with the kids' tuition? I was the silent support beam no one ever saw, but always leaned on. I never got a thank you. I didn't even expect one anymore. I used to wonder if I was imagining it. Maybe it wasn't favoritism. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe they loved us both the same, just in different ways. But that fantasy started falling apart years ago, piece by piece. Every time Grant would forget my birthday and my mom would excuse it. He's just busy. Or when I wasn't invited to the family beach house trip because there wasn't enough space, even though I'd offered to pay for my own room. Or when I helped my parents pay off their car loan and no one even mentioned it afterward. I kept receipts, not literally, but mentally. There was a ledger inside me, and it grew heavier every year. I remember one Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. I brought a pumpkin pie and some new board games, hoping for a night of laughter and family warmth. Grant showed up an hour late, announced they were doing a keto cleanse and couldn't eat anything, and somehow the night shifted around him like gravity rearranged itself just to orbit his preferences. My dad asked him about business. My mom doted on the twins. I cleared the table alone. I remember looking out the window that night, watching their SUV disappear down the driveway, and thinking, if I just stopped showing up, would anyone even notice? But I didn't stop. I kept showing up, kept giving, kept answering calls and transferring money and swallowing the bitter taste of being the afterthought. Because that's what I was. The forgotten son. Even in childhood, it was like that. Grant was the golden boy with a grin that could melt teachers and coaches alike. He got away with skipping homework and still got praise. I once got grounded for getting a B+. I was the one who fixed the family computer when it crashed, who stayed up helping mom navigate spreadsheets when she tried to launch her Etsy business. I learned to disappear while being useful. I suppose that's what made it so easy for them, to rely on me while pretending not to see me. Sometimes I caught glimpses of it in other people's eyes. Friends who'd come to family events with me and left with a quiet, confused expression. Do they always talk over you like that? One girlfriend had asked. I'd shrugged. That's just how it is. She didn't last long. Most of them didn't. It's hard to build a life with someone who's always playing second fiddle in a concert no one asked him to join. There were moments, small ones, that nearly cracked me. The time I sent my parents a framed picture of us from when I was 8, trying to remind them I'd existed once as more than a paycheck. They never hung it. Said they didn't want to clutter the walls. I remember walking into their house 6 months later and seeing Grant's face on a massive canvas in the hallway, his whole family smiling under perfect lighting like a stock photo you'd see in a dentist's office. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it like it held some answer. It didn't. And still I gave. Not because I wanted their approval. At some point, I stopped expecting that. But because it was easier than saying no. Easier than hearing the disappointment in my mother's voice or the passive-aggressive jokes from Grant. Good ol' Miles, always saving the day. As if that was my role. My identity. A bank in human form. But I was tired. Tired of being reliable only when it benefited them. Tired of carrying emotional and financial weight for people who barely saw me. Tired of smiling at holidays while being ignored at the table. I didn't want to be the forgotten son anymore. Not out of bitterness. Just clarity. That clarity was starting to take root. I could feel it like the quiet tremble before a storm. Something inside me was shifting. I didn't know it yet, but it had already begun. For as long as I can remember, I've wanted to see the world, not just through the glow of my computer monitor, where I bookmarked travel blogs and pinned scenic photography, but with my own eyes. I used to imagine myself wandering the cobbled streets of Prague, sipping espresso in a Parisian cafe, or riding a motorbike along the coast of Thailand. But each time I tried to take a step toward that dream, life or more accurately, someone else's life, would block the path. There was always an emergency. A leaking roof at my parents' house. A sudden spike in my niece's school fees. A car that broke down. A favor Grant needed for a temporary cash flow issue. I had the money. I always did, because I saved, planned, sacrificed. But every time I looked up flight prices or imagined walking through the Gothic quarter of Barcelona, the world would close its doors with a loud bang, reminding me that my role wasn't to explore, it was to provide. Quietly, consistently. But this time felt different. It was late one night, and I had been up, scrolling through pictures of Montjuic Castle and the color-drenched mosaics of Park Güell, the kind of things that had stirred my wanderlust for years. The idea had been tugging at me more urgently lately, growing louder with every ignored call and cold text from family asking for more money, never asking how I was. I sat there staring at a flight promotion blinking at me from my screen, one click away from something mine. I hesitated, but then I looked around my condo. Clean, quiet, and perfectly organized. It was everything I'd built, yet it felt like a cage lined with gold bars, secure, yet suffocating. My bank account was healthy. My job allowed remote work. I was single. There was no one to answer to. No one I had to take care of, at least, not anymore. Not if I chose not to. So I did something I never allowed myself to do. I booked it. Barcelona. 2 weeks. Solo. My finger hovered before I clicked confirm, and when the reservation went through, I just sat there staring at the screen. I half expected my phone to ring, for my mom to call and say, "Miles, your father needs surgery," or "Grant just lost his job. Can you float them again?" But the phone stayed silent. It felt illicit, doing something for myself. I didn't tell anyone. Not a soul. It wasn't an act of rebellion. It was preservation. I didn't want their guilt trips, the manipulation disguised as concern, or the inevitable, couldn't that money go towards something more responsible? I kept it secret not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted it untouched. Just once, I wanted something that was purely, selfishly mine. In the days leading up to the trip, I walked around like I was holding a private treasure in my pocket. I kept checking my email to confirm the booking was real, that I hadn't dreamed it. I bought a guidebook and hid it under my bed like contraband. I started brushing up on basic Spanish, practicing the words under my breath as I made coffee in the morning. I even bought a new suitcase, sleek, black, perfect for carry-on. It felt good. No, exhilarating. I started to breathe a little easier, like air was finding its way into places in me that had been starved for years. Of course, the universe noticed my happiness and tested it immediately. 2 days before my flight, my mother called. "Hey, honey, how are you?" Her voice was light, too light. I could hear it, the subtle shift she always made when she was leading up to a request. I stayed neutral. "I'm doing okay." "Oh, good. Listen, we've got a bit of a situation. The gutters are falling apart and water's leaking into the basement. Your father says it's going to cost a couple grand to fix." There it was. The hook. The not-so-invisible string tied to every interaction. I paused. In the past, I would have asked for the quote, transferred the money by the end of the day, and thanked them for letting me help, as if it were an honor. But not this time. "I'm actually not able to help right now," I said. The words were quiet but firm. A pause on the other end. "Oh," she said, clearly caught off guard. "Are things tight for you?" "No. I've just made some plans," I replied. She didn't ask what kind, didn't ask if I was okay, or what I needed. Instead, she sighed like I'd just dropped a burden she hadn't realized I was carrying. "Well, that's disappointing. I thought you'd always be the one we could count on." That sentence echoed in my chest. Not, "I hope you're okay." Not, "You've done so much." Just disappointment that the well had run dry. I ended the call soon after and sat in silence. The guilt tried to creep in, that familiar weight I'd carried so long it felt like bone. But I didn't let it win. I was going to Barcelona. Alone. For once, I was choosing myself. And no one, needed to know. The airport was buzzing with that strange mix of anticipation and exhaustion. People moved with purpose, some excited, others dragging their feet, cradling coffees and carry-ons like lifelines. I had arrived early, like always, unable to shake the reflex of being overly prepared. There was comfort in order, in checking in early and breezing through security with no surprises. I found a seat near the boarding gate, tucked against a window, and let myself sink into the moment. Barcelona was only hours away. That thought alone sent a pulse of electricity through me. For once, I wasn't flying to visit family or attend a conference. This trip was mine. I had packed lightly: jeans, walking shoes, a guidebook, and a passport that had never been used. I had barely slept the night before, not out of nerves, but because my mind kept racing with all the possibilities: sunrise walks through old streets, tapas in hidden courtyards, a quiet museum or two. I looked up when I heard the announcement about a delay. 45 minutes. I didn't mind. I had my headphones, a book I probably wouldn't read, and nothing urgent pulling me back. And that's when I saw them. At first, it didn't register. I caught a glimpse of someone who looked familiar in the periphery of my vision, a flash of Grant's swaggering stride. I turned, and my heart thudded. It was them. All of them. My parents. Grant. His wife Sabrina. Their 2 kids, dressed in matching pastel hoodies like they were headed to a magazine shoot. And they were laughing. Loudly. Carrying expensive leather duffels and rolling designer luggage. They stood in line at the first-class counter, smiling like they were the stars of a show I'd never been invited to. I sat frozen. Not out of jealousy. Not even anger. It was something else. A hollow silence settled in my chest as I watched them chat with the agent, Sabrina flipping her hair, my father chuckling as he handed over passports. And then I heard it, faint but sharp. "Too bad Miles couldn't come," my mother said, adjusting her sunglasses as if the idea of me was a mild inconvenience. Then Grant snorted. He wouldn't have fit in anyway. They all laughed. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I felt everything and nothing in that moment. A strange, suspended disconnection, like watching a life I might have belonged to in a parallel universe. Except I didn't belong. Not really. I never had. I stared at them, hidden behind my sunglasses, still unnoticed. The absurdity of it all hit me. I had funded their emergencies, kept them afloat while they took luxury vacations without a second thought about whether I was okay, or if I wanted to be included. Not that I would have accepted. I wouldn't have wanted to be a tag-along in Grant's picture-perfect tableau. But the point was, they never asked, never considered. I remembered the time I paid their mortgage shortfall so they wouldn't fall behind. The tuition top-up for the twins' private school. The dental work my mom insisted couldn't wait. All those transfers. All those polite thanks followed by weeks of silence. And here they were, flying first class to God knows where, living in a bubble I was only good enough to support, not occupy. Something shifted in me then. It wasn't a dramatic break, not a surge of anger or a public confrontation. It was quiet, clean, almost surgical, a severing. I looked down at my boarding pass. Economy. Row 29, seat F. And I smiled. Let them have their champagne and reclining seats. Let them travel in their curated little pod of importance. I was going to Barcelona, alone, free, unburdened. Every euro I spent would be mine, not filtered through guilt or obligation. I would wake up in a different world and not once have to think about whether Grant had enough saved for the next school term or whether Mom and Dad were hiding another expense behind a sugar-coated phone call. I stood and made my way toward a quieter area of the terminal, away from them. They didn't notice. Of course they didn't. As I walked, something loosened inside me, like the first real exhale after holding your breath for far too long. I didn't belong in their orbit, not because I wasn't good enough, but because I had outgrown the role they wrote for me. The forgotten son, the dependable fallback, the invisible crutch. No more. I was still quiet, still steady, but no longer silent. Not inside. Let them fly first class. Let them laugh. I was done funding their lives. It was time to live mine. Coming back from Barcelona was like surfacing from underwater. My skin was still sun-warmed, my muscles relaxed from long, wandering days, and there was a new stillness in me, one I hadn't known I needed until it filled the hollows that had lived inside me for years. The trip hadn't been extravagant. I didn't stay in 5-star hotels or eat at Michelin-star restaurants. I walked. I breathed. I let myself be no one but me. And that had been enough. I got home late on a Sunday evening, unlocked my condo door, and dropped my suitcase in the hallway. For a while, I just stood there, listening to the quiet hum of my refrigerator and the gentle creak of my heating unit kicking on. Everything was right where I left it, clean, in order, mine. I made coffee the next morning, still a little jet-lagged, and opened the blinds to let in the late winter sunlight. My phone had stayed blissfully silent throughout the trip. I'd muted all notifications before I boarded the plane and hadn't once felt the urge to check. I didn't need to know what was happening back home. For 2 weeks, their world had kept spinning without me, and I didn't miss being part of it. That was the strangest revelation of all. And yet, it didn't take long. By 9:13 a.m., my mother's name lit up the screen. It was like clockwork. I stared at the phone for a moment, thumb hovering. I could have let it ring. I could have blocked the number. But something inside me wanted to know, would it be different this time? Would she ask about my trip, notice I'd been away? I answered, "Hi, Mom. Miles, honey. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." I smiled dryly. "What's going on?" Her voice shifted instantly into that familiar tone, syrupy, strained, and lined with tension. "Your father and I just got back from a quick trip, and wouldn't you know it, the water heater went out. Flooded half the laundry room. The guy came this morning. It's going to cost nearly $3,000 to fix everything." I stared out the window, watching a squirrel dart across the fence outside. She didn't ask if I had time to talk. She didn't ask how I was. Not a single question about where I'd been or what I'd been doing. Just the usual, "Here's a problem, solve it." I took a slow breath and let it sit before I answered. "I'm not going to help with that." Silence. I could almost hear her processing the words, trying to decide if she'd misheard. "What do you mean, Miles?" "I mean, I'm not paying for it. I can't keep being your emergency fund. It's not sustainable." A sharp, defensive scoff burst through the line. "We wouldn't be asking if we had other options." "That's the thing, Mom," I said, keeping my voice even. "You've never had other options because you never had to find them. You always knew I'd say yes. This is coming out of nowhere." "No," I interrupted, calmly. "It's been coming for years." There was another silence, deeper now. I imagined her standing in their kitchen, hand on her hip, maybe blinking in disbelief that I wasn't falling into line. I knew that tone too well, the one that signaled her version of betrayal. "You've changed," she said finally. Not a compliment. An accusation. "I have," I replied. "And it's the best thing I've ever done." "Is this about Grant?" she snapped, and there it was. Always about Grant. I shook my head, though she couldn't see it. "No, Mom. It's about me. It's about finally realizing I don't owe anyone the pieces of my life just because I've always been the one to quietly hand them over." "So you're just going to leave us hanging?" "I'm trusting that you're adults," I said, "and that you'll figure it out." She scoffed again, bitter and sharp. "Wow, I didn't realize you were this selfish." That stung, but not in the way it used to. Once, her disappointment could have folded me in half. Now, it felt like a gust of wind that couldn't touch the foundation I'd started building for myself. "I'm not selfish," I said. "I'm finally being fair. To myself." She hung up without another word. I let the silence settle, the click of the call ending echoing into the room. My hand shook just a little as I set the phone down on the counter. Not from fear, just from the weight of finally choosing myself. It felt like pressing against a bruise to see if it still hurt. It did, but less than I expected. I poured the rest of my coffee, sat at the table, and stared out the window. The world hadn't ended. My life hadn't crumbled. All that had happened was that for once, I'd said no. And the world was still turning. I hadn't realized how many versions of myself I'd buried under the expectation of being the good son. The reliable one. The invisible hand that steadied everyone else. But I wasn't invisible anymore. And I wasn't angry. Not really. I was just done. The silence that followed was unlike any I'd experienced before. It wasn't the cold, passive-aggressive kind that used to echo through family dinners when I said something Grant didn't like. It wasn't the absence of conversation after I'd deposited money and no one called to say thank you. No, this silence felt like standing alone on a mountaintop, steady, expansive, and entirely my own. For the first time in years, there were no calls, no requests, no check-ins disguised as pleas for help. Just me, in my space, with peace curling in the corners like sunlight through a window. It lasted 3 days. On the 4th, my phone lit up with a name I knew would shatter it all. Grant. I didn't answer. He texted 30 seconds later. "Seriously? You're ignoring Mom now? What the hell is wrong with you?" I stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. The old version of me would have replied instantly calm, reasonable, deferential, trying to explain myself in a way that would avoid a fight. But this time, I didn't respond at all. I just locked my phone and slid it face down on the counter. 2 hours later, "You're being childish. Grow up. This family's always depended on you because you could actually handle things." I snorted at that one, leaning against the kitchen island, the words making my chest tighten and my jaw clench. Not because they hurt. No, I'd outgrown that. They irritated me like an old splinter that never quite healed, a reminder of how long I'd been expected to carry weight that didn't belong to me. Another ping. Wow. All this because we didn't invite you to the trip? Get over yourself. Ah. So he knew I'd seen them. I put the phone down again, slower this time. I walked to the window, looking out over Crescent Hollow. Trees swayed in the early spring breeze, and the light had shifted into that golden hue that made everything look cinematic. I let it wash over me, letting his words drift away like leaves on wind. That evening, another message. Mom says you refuse to help. That's messed up, man. Do you even care what happens to them? I stared at that one for a long time. The audacity, the entitlement embedded in it, stung in a different way. It wasn't just that Grant expected me to help. He believed I owed it to them. He thought my usefulness was my role, and that stepping away from it meant I had betrayed some sacred contract. The next morning, a final message. You're just jealous. Always have been. You can't stand that people like me more. You'll die alone in that overpriced condo with no one to call. Congrats. That one made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so deeply, transparently insecure. There it was, laid bare Grant's panic. He wasn't angry because I'd hurt our parents. He was angry because I'd taken away the safety net. I'd removed the buffer that let him live his shiny, polished life without consequence. And more than that, he was angry I was okay. I didn't reply. Not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. No explanation would soften it. No polite boundary would be respected. I'd said my piece. And now, I was just done. The silence returned after that, but this time it was different. It was heavier at first, more personal. Like the air had shifted in my condo, carrying traces of the storm that had passed through. But it didn't rattle me. I made dinner. I played old vinyl records. I went for long walks without checking my phone. I had always thought silence meant something was wrong, that I had failed or upset someone. That if people weren't calling, I was somehow forgotten again. But now I was learning a new kind of quiet. One that wasn't punishment, but refuge. They were spiraling. I could feel it, even through the stillness. The way Grant's messages grew frantic. The desperation threaded in the last few lines. It was like watching a tower begin to tilt, and for once, I wasn't sprinting to brace the foundation. I was just observing. Let them figure it out. Let them pay for the water heater or patch the roof or face the consequences of living without a fallback plan. I had my own life now, and it was no longer for rent. The peace was mine, and I was keeping it. I should have known he'd show up. Grant had never been one to let silence win. Ignoring him was like tossing gasoline on a fire. He'd smolder for a while, but eventually the eruption would come. Still, I didn't expect to open my door at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning and find him standing there, red in the face, veins taut at his temple, clutching a leather wallet like it was Exhibit A in a trial he planned to win. Nice place, he muttered as he brushed past me without being invited. Looks like selfishness pays well. I didn't answer. I closed the door behind him slowly, grounding myself with the click of the latch. This was my home, my space. He could bring his storm, but I wasn't going to drown in it. Grant marched into the kitchen like he owned the place and tossed his wallet on the counter with a loud slap. You've got some nerve, you know that? I stayed leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, voice steady. I didn't invite you here. No, of course not. You're too busy pretending you're better than the rest of us now. He picked up my coffee mug, glanced at the quote printed on it. Peace is a full cup and no company, and gave a bitter laugh. Fitting. I waited. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to unload. What happened to you, Miles? He snapped, finally turning to face me. You used to be reliable. You used to care. Now you're just cold. I used to be convenient, I corrected. You only think I've changed because I stopped letting you take advantage of me. Grant scoffed. Oh, come on. You're acting like we leached off you. You did, I said, walking into the kitchen now, slow and deliberate, until I stood across from him. And you still are. Every time something went wrong, every time Mom and Dad hit a bump, guess who they called? Me. Not you. Never you. That's because you could afford it. I shook my head. No. It's because you wouldn't. You knew I'd say yes. You knew I'd keep showing up, fixing things, making it easier for you to keep living above your means and pretending everything was fine. He opened his mouth, but I cut him off. I paid for your kids' tuition one year, Grant. Do you even remember that? Because I do. I also remember you posting vacation photos a month later from that Bahamas trip. His jaw tightened. We had it planned already, and you didn't offer to pay me back. We're family, Miles. That's what family does. I leaned in slightly, my voice calm but sharp. No, that's what I did. That's what I've done for years. But this family? It doesn't know how to give. Just take. The room fell silent for a moment. Just the hum of the fridge between us. He looked around, taking in the space, sleek countertops, a small succulent on the windowsill, the faint scent of cinnamon from the candle I'd lit earlier. I guess it's easy to say all this now that you've got your little life set up. No wife, no kids, no obligations. Just you and your money. I didn't flinch. You think that's why I'm done helping? Because I don't have kids to feed. Isn't it? He shot back. You've got no idea what pressure is like. You mean the pressure I've been absorbing for all of you since I was 22? That stopped him. I remember when Dad lost his job, I said quietly. I was fresh out of college, barely scraping by, but I still helped. I gave him half my savings. Didn't even blink. And when you crashed your car and needed a loan, I sent it. When Mom needed that root canal, done. When your water heater broke, guess who covered it? He looked away. I've swallowed every slight, I continued, every backhanded comment, every exclusion, every guilt trip, and I still gave. I did it because I thought if I kept showing up, eventually someone would notice. That maybe, just maybe, I'd matter as more than just a wallet with a face. He stared at the counter like it held answers. But it didn't. It never did. Well, he muttered, finally. If you're trying to burn bridges, congrats. Mission accomplished. I nodded. I'm not burning them, Grant. I'm walking away before they collapse on me. He grabbed his wallet and turned toward the door. You think you're better than us now? No, I said, following him calmly. I just know I deserve better than being used. He yanked the door open, paused, then turned back, his face twisted with something between fury and disbelief. Don't come crawling back when you realize family's all you've got. I won't, I said simply. Then he was gone. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, heart pounding, not from fear or regret, but from the electric hum of release. For the first time, I had said everything I needed to say. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't broken. I had stood my ground. And I was still standing. I didn't need to call to know what was happening. I could feel the ripple effects even before word reached me. When someone like Grant is forced to step into responsibility, even for a moment, the ground beneath him starts to tremble. He spent his entire life living in a glass house. And now the pressure I'd carried for years was finally settling on his shoulders. It wasn't built for him. Not really. And the cracks were beginning to show. It started with little murmurs from town. A neighbor mentioned, offhandedly, that Grant's lawn had gone unmowed for weeks. Someone else said Sabrina looked tense at the school fundraiser, all clipped smiles and tight gestures. Then Lila from work, who knew everyone's business whether you asked or not, told me Grant had been seen at the credit union, arguing with someone behind the desk. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. I knew the signs. Without my regular financial lifeline, my parents' mortgage payments had started slipping. I'd warned them years ago their retirement plan wasn't sustainable, not with the lifestyle they wanted and the debts they kept pretending weren't real. But warnings had always bounced off them like pebbles against stone. Now the bank wasn't so forgiving. And without me playing safety net, they had no one else to soften the fall. So it landed on Grant. I imagined him cutting that first check with gritted teeth, realizing just how much I'd covered all this time. That the cushy family photo he flaunted on social media, smiling kids, spotless SUV, luxury vacations, had always had a hidden scaffolding, me. And now it was gone. I didn't gloat. That's not who I am. But I didn't feel sorry for him either. What did surprise me was how fast the illusion unraveled. One evening, while sipping tea and scrolling through local property listings, I'd been toying with the idea of investing in a rental unit. I saw something odd. A listing for a 5-bedroom colonial in our old neighborhood. The address looked familiar. Too familiar. I clicked the photo. That porch swing. Those blue shutters. My parents' house. They were selling. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it settle in. It should have hit harder. Should have stirred some nostalgic ache. But all I felt was a quiet, detached understanding. The castle they'd built, where Grant had always been the prince and I the quiet squire, was crumbling. Without someone to prop it up, the fantasy simply couldn't hold. I thought about my mother and her perfectly folded dish towels, the way she used to brag about her garden club meetings and how Grant and Sabrina are just doing so well. I wondered what it felt like now, realizing her safety net had a spine and a voice and a choice, and had walked away. I heard from Lila again a few days later. "Did you hear about Sabrina?" she said, half-whispered like it was sacred gossip. "She's been snapping at everyone lately. I think things are tense at home." Apparently, Grant had to cash out some of their investments. They're worried about the kids' tuition. I nodded but didn't comment. "They say she told a friend she didn't sign up for this," Lila added, wide-eyed. I almost laughed. Sabrina hadn't signed up for this. Of course not. She'd signed up for country clubs and curated family photos. For vacations in Turks and Caicos and back-to-school shopping at boutique stores. Not for bouncing checks and stressed-out phone calls to contractors. But that's the thing about living a life built on borrowed stability, it always catches up. I wondered if Grant resented me now, not just for walking away, but for making it clear that I ever held this kind of weight to begin with. That maybe, deep down, he'd always known I was the quiet force behind the curtain, but seeing the machine break down without me exposed just how fragile his success really was. Part of me thought he might reach out again. Not with rage this time, but with desperation. A crack in his voice instead of a threat. But he didn't. Whether out of pride or pure stubbornness, he stayed silent. And I didn't break it. I went about my days with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I cooked meals for myself without worrying about bank transfers or budgeting for someone else's crisis. I walked through Crescent Hollow in the early mornings, hands in my pockets, the cool spring air brushing my face. I spent weekends exploring nearby towns, trying new coffee shops, flipping through secondhand bookstores. The absence of their chaos was not a hole, it was space. Finally, I had room to breathe. I didn't need to witness the downfall up close. I could see it clearly from here. They had built a life on the assumption that I'd always be there to catch the bricks before they fell. But I was done playing the foundation. Now that it was crumbling, I didn't feel guilt. I felt free. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I got the message from Lila. Just a quiet buzz on my phone while I was sitting in the little cafe near my condo, sipping a cordial and reading a travel article about Kyoto. I wasn't expecting anything important. I'd been slowly retraining myself to believe that if a text came in, it didn't mean there was a crisis waiting for me to fix. But I saw her name, and curiosity nudged me to open it. "Check this out. You're gonna love it," followed by a screenshot. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was a blurry image of a group chat, the kind of thing you'd expect from a gossip thread between bored suburbanites. But then I saw the name at the top of the message, Grant Whitaker. And just below it, "Miles is being a selfish prick. He has the money. He just wants to punish us." I blinked, then scrolled. "He thinks he's better than everyone now. Took one stupid vacation and suddenly he's too good for his own family. Who even does that? Just cuts people off?" Then another message from someone else. "Didn't he help pay for your mortgage a while back?" Grant's reply. "That's what family does. He acts like he's some kind of martyr. Please. He's just bitter no one ever cared enough to coddle him." I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the words settle in. I didn't feel anger, not the way I would have a year ago. What I felt, more than anything, was clarity. There it was. The truth, laid bare in pixels. Grant didn't just resent me for stepping away. He felt entitled to the version of me that had stayed quiet, compliant, and endlessly generous. He genuinely believed I owed him, and that withholding anything, money, attention, care, was an act of cruelty. A betrayal. But here's what he didn't understand. I wasn't withholding anything. I was reclaiming what had always been mine. I read the screenshot again, slower this time, watching the tone shift from arrogant to almost desperate. He was unraveling and trying to spin the narrative before people noticed. But he'd forgotten something important. People did notice. They always had. They just didn't say anything until the silence became uncomfortable. Lila followed up with a text. "He's spiraling. Everyone in that chat sees it. They're just too polite to say it out loud." I typed back, "Thanks for sending this. Honestly, I feel lighter reading it." And I did. For years, I had imagined conversations like this happening behind closed doors. Whispers at dinner tables, casual dismissals of my choices, backhanded sympathy turned into scorn. But now that I'd seen the proof, now that the masks were off, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt free. There's something about confirmation that settles the soul. I didn't need to question anymore. Didn't need to explain or justify or run mental reruns of our childhood trying to find the moment the scale tipped in Grant's favor. I'd always known it. But now I didn't have to doubt it. I put my phone down, took another sip of my cordial, and looked out the window. Outside, the street was bathed in soft spring sunlight. A couple strolled by holding hands, and a kid on a skateboard wobbled along the sidewalk, laughing when he nearly tipped. It was a beautiful, ordinary day, and none of it was interrupted by a phone call from my mother or a passive-aggressive text from my brother. No sudden expense looming, no subtle manipulation demanding I rearrange my life for someone else's comfort. Just peace. Mine. Later that evening, I pulled out an old notebook I hadn't touched in years. It was worn at the edges, half filled with travel ideas and bucket list dreams I'd convinced myself would never happen. On the last page, I scribbled something I didn't even know I'd been thinking until the words appeared. You don't owe anyone your peace, not even family. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was carrying someone else's weight. I wasn't keeping secrets. I wasn't biting my tongue to avoid making waves. I wasn't checking my account to see if I had enough to cover both my rent and someone else's mistake. I was just here. Fully, quietly, completely. Grant's messages weren't about me. Not really. They were about losing control. About watching the structure he'd relied on without gratitude fall apart without warning. He thought I was selfish because I stopped bending. But maybe I was never meant to bend in the first place. Maybe I was always meant to stand. I knew it was only a matter of time before my father called. It had been weeks since I told my mother I wouldn't be footing the bill for their busted water heater, and even longer since I last responded to one of Grant's self-righteous tirades. The silence had grown roots between us, tangled and thick. But Ronald Whitaker was not a man who enjoyed silence, at least not when it wasn't on his terms. The call came on a Sunday. Fitting, really. Sundays used to be for family dinners, where Grant held court with his stories and I filled my plate in the background, nodding at the right moments, laughing when prompted. Those dinners had long since turned into cold leftovers and empty obligations. No, it was just another day. My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter. I glanced at it. Dad, lighting up the screen. I let it ring until it almost stopped. Then, for reasons I couldn't explain, I answered. Miles. His voice was sharp, unyielding. No greeting. No warmth. Hi, Dad. I don't understand what's going on with you. He got right to it, as always. Your mother's been beside herself. Grant says you've cut everyone off. What the hell is this? I stared out the window, watching a few kids ride their bikes down the street, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. It felt like watching a different world. A lighter one. I've decided I'm done being the family's safety net, I said plainly. That's all. You call ignoring your own mother nothing? His voice rose, brittle and angry. You think you're too good for us now? I let out a quiet breath. No, I just think I deserve a life that's mine. Not one constantly rearranged to clean up after everyone else's messes. You make it sound like we've never done anything for you, he snapped. I'm not talking about childhood birthday parties or car rides to school, I replied. I'm talking about the last 15 years, where every time something went wrong, you called me. Not Grant. Me. You were the one who always offered. Because you trained me to. Because saying no meant guilt, distance, disappointment. I was always the dependable one, because you taught me that love was conditional on performance, on obedience, on how useful I was. That's not true. It is, I said, quieter this time. And what's worse, you never even saw it. You treated my help like an obligation instead of a kindness. You expected it. You demanded it. He was silent for a beat. Then, colder than before, he asked, What exactly do you want from us? Nothing, I said. That's the whole point. I don't want anything. I just want to be free of the weight I never agreed to carry. So you're cutting ties? After everything? No, I said carefully. I'm choosing myself. After everything. There was a long, heavy pause. Then, your mother always said you were different. Sensitive. I thought she meant it as a compliment. Now I see what she meant. I flinched at that, how he wielded disappointment like a weapon. But it didn't sink as deep this time. I'm not ashamed of being sensitive, I told him. It's what kept me from turning into someone who bullies people into obedience. Someone who thinks money fixes everything and that love can be earned through silence. He let out a bitter exhale. You think you're better than us? No, I said. I think I'm finally better to myself than I've ever been. Then came the silence, not angry or defensive, but absolute. A wall being built, brick by brick. He didn't say goodbye. Didn't hang up politely. Just the sound of a line going dead. I set the phone down and stared at it for a moment, my pulse steady, my chest not aching the way I thought it might. That call had always been coming. A final confrontation. The last card on the table. I'd always feared being cast out. losing the last thread of connection. But now that it had happened, I didn't feel lost. I felt whole. After that call, something inside me settled. Not like a door slamming shut, but like one finally closing softly behind me as I walked away. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just made tea, put on a record, and sat on my balcony as the sun dipped below the trees. They wouldn't call again. I knew that. Maybe Grant would rage in some group chat. Maybe my mother would cry behind closed doors and complain to cousins at the next family reunion. My father, though, he'd made his decision. That silence, I knew, would be permanent. And oddly enough, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. I heard about it through someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Jordan, an old classmate from high school who ran into me at the farmer's market on a sunny Saturday. We exchanged the usual small talk at first, the polite sort of catching up that always feels slightly rehearsed. Then, as he picked through a bundle of kale, he said, "You hear about your brother? Sold the house. Moved into a rental across town. Smaller place near Bellwood." I blinked. "Really?" "Yeah," he said, glancing up. "I figured you knew." I didn't. And yet, I wasn't surprised. The cracks had long since turned into chasms. It was only a matter of time before Grant's curated world gave out completely under the weight of real responsibility. The house, with its sprawling yard and gleaming entryway, had always been more about appearances than stability. Without someone to quietly bail them out, they'd had to downsize. Guess that dreams finally caught up with him, I said, mostly to myself. Jordan didn't ask for context. He just nodded and moved on to the honey stand, and I let him go, content to leave the past where it belonged, in conversations that no longer required my participation. A week later, I got wind that my parents had also moved out of Valemont Estates. The grand house with the blue shutters and rose bushes sold. They were living in a modest apartment now, somewhere near the train station. No more HOA fees, no manicured front lawn, no garden club or neighborhood watch to lord over. I didn't ask for details. I didn't call. I didn't text. Their lives had continued without me, slimmed down, quieter, and likely more difficult. But I didn't owe them rescue. That reflex was gone, replaced by a clarity I never thought I'd find. They had each other, and for once, that had to be enough. And me? I was thriving. I had just gotten back from Kyoto, my second international trip since Barcelona. I'd spent 2 weeks in Japan, walking temple paths under cherry blossoms, sipping matcha in quiet alley cafes, and finding peace in unfamiliar places. I traveled light, lived slow, and didn't check my phone more than twice a day. There was no one to report to, no one waiting with another request. Just me and the rhythm of a life that finally felt like mine. I came home to my condo and didn't dread a single voicemail. There were none. I cooked dinner while music played low in the background, a playlist I'd made myself. I sat at my kitchen table alone and felt no loneliness. Instead, I felt ownership. Of my space, of my time, of my peace. There had been a time when I thought family was everything. That blood meant loyalty and sacrifice and unquestioned devotion. But now I saw it differently. Family, real family, sees you. Not just when they need you, but when you're silent, when you're still, when you're not offering anything but your presence. Mine never did. And so, I built something new. Not loud or flashy, but solid. I'd invested in myself, my health, my friendships, my quiet ambitions. I'd started learning photography. Volunteered at a youth coding workshop on weekends. Took long, aimless walks with no destination. I'd stopped trying to prove my worth. More than anything, I'd stopped asking for their love in ways they couldn't give it. The last thread between us had burned away during that final call with my father. Since then, the silence had grown deeper, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It didn't press down on my chest or whisper in my ear at night. It didn't make me question my choices. It simply existed. Like fog lifting. I had blocked their numbers. Not out of spite, but for closure. I didn't need to hear more guilt or get dragged back into the gravitational pull of their dysfunction. I learned that boundaries are love turned inward, and I was ready to love myself enough to keep them. Every now and then, I thought about them, not with pain, but with distance. Like characters in a book I once read, vivid and flawed and tangled. But the story had ended. The last chapter had been written, and I was living in the sequel. I didn't know where they would go from here. Maybe they'd adjust. Maybe Grant would learn humility. Maybe my parents would realize what they lost. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd carry on, bitter and blaming and bewildered. Either way, it wasn't my burden to carry anymore. I had finally stepped out from the shadows of someone else's expectations and into the full light of my own life. I was no longer the forgotten son. I was just Miles. And I was finally, beautifully free.